Take a chance and try my fare. It will grow on you, I swear. Soon it will taste good to you. If by then you should want more, all the things I've done before will inspire things quite new. It's kind of like, it has a little bit of the Walt Whitman quality of,
Yeah,
like do
that's
not,
actually,
yeah,
yeah,
do
that's
not,
funny because like
yeah, do
when
not
I was
close
reading,
your doors
yeah,
to me, great
yeah.
libraries or whatever it is.
Well, like when I was originally, I actually can see my notes and like I have a couple of actually specifically I read it like aphorism 7 and there's a couple of other ones. Like I actually have a note saying like it like I remember reading Song myself shortly before I read this and it kind of like weirdly reminded me of it despite I feel like most people would say that they, Walt Whitman, the great democratic poet versus Nietzsche, like couldn't be more different. But it's number 7 is lure them down and come after me, follow your own self faithfully, take time and thus you follow me. And that's kind of very much a Whitmanian kind of, that I stop somewhere waiting for you kind of like
Mm-hmm.
sentiment in that sense. I just found like I like that you said that because it's like very I think like they're very obviously very different in terms of their like specifics of where they're coming from. But I think related to what you're saying before about like a lot of like what Nietzsche said being an odds on a surface level with like say for example like left wing politics or whatever. I would say what a lot of time I think his conclusions oftentimes tend to be have a hell of a lot of validity to them. It's like how we get there that sometimes you see the
Mm-hmm.
datedness or the stuff that like maybe doesn't hold up as well. Which I think that like that's much better than the other way around, where somebody has like a way of getting at things that is right, but their conclusions are all bullshit, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I think that that's interesting then that like some of his stuff, I think that like as poems, I would kind of agree with Joel if like he was here right now. I would agree with him saying that like as poems in themselves, like they're like nothing special. But I think like one, they would kind of work as little aphorisms in and of themselves. But I think like even compared to some of the later aphorisms, the fact the rhymes give them a more playful quality, it means he can kind of get at things more obliquely or more playfully than he would be able to otherwise. And I think like also even just the very concept of having like these like rhymes and songs as he calls them, it sort of just goes along just very well with the whole kind of the gay science. And like he uses these metaphors of dancing, of joyfulness. Same in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he does it again. This sort of and like of convalescence and this sense of joy and like life affirming kind of stuff. It kind of just strengthens that concept that he's working with because like it is something that has a quality of like being seemingly like superficial or kind of playful or whatever. And I think the very fact of like, some of these like the little like rhymes, they have things that in themselves they could work as an aphorism if you used to just state them that way. But I
Mm-hmm.
think the very fact of doing them as poems, it's kind of nearly a kind of deliberate like pushing in the face of anyone say, well, why aren't you doing this in a systematic way? It's like, no, this is a kind of philosophy that needs to be expressed in these more light-hearted ways. It's like a very like form meeting function, style meeting substance kind of like thing, which is like, again one of those things that just makes this like makes it sound out as an artistic work, as an artistic gambit
Mm-hmm.
in that sense.
Number 9 is one of my favorites in this little collection called My Roses. And one thing I have to say is, specifically to what you said about, this whole idea of the gay science, the playfulness, right? When he says gay science, right, to viewers that might not understand, right, he's talking about, first of all, the science that he's talking about is, you could say poetry specifically, but more generally, anything that requires a substantial amount of craft and care, right?
Yeah,
And to
it's
go about,
also translated at times as the joyful knowledge. So it's der Friedliche Wissenschaft in German. That's probably a butchered pronunciation, but like, so it's like Wissenschaft is like, it's the word for science, but it's also kind of knowledge or that, like just that kind of thing in general.
it's a knowledge that takes some craft to get to, right? It's not some sort of
Yeah,
ready-made cookie cutter type thing, but
like a
also,
process or yeah.
yeah, yeah, and also this playfulness. So, and Kaufman, right? His translations of these I think are excellent, right? I mean, I haven't read the originals, but they are sufficiently good in English, and it seems like they do get at this idea that Nietzsche wants to expose. So anyway, number 9 is titled My Roses. Yes, my joy wants to amuse. Every joy wants to amuse. Would you like to pick my roses? You must stoop and stick your noses between thorns and rocky views, and not be afraid of bruises. For my joy enjoys good teases, for my joy enjoys good ruses. Would you like to pick my roses? right? This kind of idea that if you truly do kind of get into Nietzsche, coming out the other end, right, there is going to be some bruises, right? I mean, again, back to this idea of like the kinds of criticism that he received from, Steven Pinker types or others. A lot of it probably is, you go through this and you really do get a little fucked up and bruised up. And many people just don't know how to deal with it, right? And the best way to deal with it, I guess, is to just kind of reject it wholesale, ignore it, say that this is irrelevant, right? He's not worth reading. But and also the one immediately after, called Scorn. There is much I drop and spill. I am full of scorn, you think. If your beaker is too full, there is much you drop and spill without scorning what you drink.
Yeah. And it's sort of very, like, I think he kind of develops that. A lot of these poems are like ones he like develops more later on. Like, I feel like that like 10 especially is like very much in that kind of like life affirming, you're not approaching the outer world out of some desire to fill up your gaps and what you lack, but you're sort of approaching it in a sense that you have enough, and you're going to approach it and like kind of like take it in and like be like, you're spilling not out of some sense, you have enough, you can sort of take and leave things for what they are. And like, which is something I think kind of does crop up in like the preface as well. And that I think one of my like ones that stood out to me actually is like, if we're going to be talking about the artistic bent, is like number 55. He can talks, it's realistic painters. True to nature, all the truth, that's art. This hallowed notion is a threadbare fable. Infinite is nature's smallest part. They paint what happens to delight their heart, and what delights them, what to paint they're able. And like, I feel like that's like a really great old take on the whole thing of like, people say like art is truth or art is that. And it's like, no, it's like art is inherently it's coming from your own limited point of view and your ability to like take like these little portions of what's in your life and what you perceive and turn it into something. And it's like, it feels like we're like Dan has his like, his usual little things about like, art is not truth and translating reality and that. So hi Dan, if you're watching this, but that's very, I feel like that's very consonant with that. Like it's very, it's that kind of attitude. It's like some of his affirmations are more limited, I feel like, but then there are times he gets at these things in a way that's like very prescient and very like, I think even beyond some of the like ways art would have been viewed in his time, like the sort of like pre-modernist, like, that kind of thing. It's quite interesting in a way, like.
Yeah, there's a long kind of history in this kind of analysis of does art get at the truth or the opposite, right? I mean, probably the most famous example being Plato, very distrustful of poets, right? Because according to him, the poets tell lies. Now, in his own kind of system, right? Maybe there isn't much room for poetry in his kind of like in his state, right? In his republic. And that's kind of like the most crass, maybe ignorant form of artistic critique. But then you get to Nietzsche, right, who comes to a similar conclusion about, that art and poetry or whatever, right? They don't necessarily express the truth, right? Maybe they get at different elements of truth in an oblique way, but it's not the truth. But to him, this is a positive, right?
Yes. And he actually. This is skipping forward a bit, but like just because it's relevant now, I actually jotted this one down. It's like the very ending of book 2. He actually has, and we could probably return to this because it does have good, it kind of segues into like play. It kind of uses this, I suppose, as a metaphor, a segue into like a wider view, his wider view of life and how to live it. But like, he kind of has this quote then that like, if we had not welcomed the arts and invited this kind of cult of the untrue, then the realization of general untruth and mendaciousness that now comes to us through science, the realization that delusion and error are conditions of human knowledge and sensation, would be utterly unbearable. So honesty would lead to nausea and suicide. But now there's a counterforce against our honesty that helps us to avoid such consequences. Art as the goodwill to appearance. So it's kind of like the view that like, he kind of then proceeds then to talk about like as an aesthetic phenomenon, existence is still bearable for us. So this is kind of and like this obviously like has to be placed in context, but it's coming about like kind of the conversation about like the not like kind of that he then expands further about like science and about like the fact of our limited ability to perceive the actual world and how it's all conditional upon our human, what, you know, our human sort of powers of perception and what we're able to do and how limited this is and that, but it's kind of like just this sort of aesthetic view of things and this ability, I guess, to kind of keep these two things in mind at once. Like it's an interesting view of the arts in and of itself, even if it's also been used as a sort of like a sort of like comparison or a sort of example of something larger. So yeah.
And you know, to trace that genealogy, right? I mean, so we got Plato, you know, poetry is false and therefore it's bad. Nietzsche, poetry is false and therefore it's good. But then, you know, if we're going to end this with sort of like, you know, Dan Schneider's comments about all this, you know, I think it's a very good synthesis in the sense that to Dan Schneider, it would not be, you know, good or bad in either case, right? Yeah. It's just, you know, like a factual observation that you could therefore use for the specific kind of, you know, object of making sure that your art is good, right? Yeah. If you're not so concerned about being truthful, you know, you could easily get lost, for example, you know, writing a historical novel where the only object in your mind essentially is like, I want to make this as realistic and in keeping with, you know, this or that ancient world, right? As much as I can, right? You will end up sacrificing art, you know, for the sake of this other object, right? You can't have multiple masters like this in a book, right? Such as that. Mm-hmm. And, you know, to Dan, it would be like, well, you know, it's not, you know, art is not truth, but use that to your advantage to make great art, right? And don't moralize about whether or not, you know, it's a good thing, like it's irrelevant. The only, you know, and that, like Dan's comment in that sense, I think is, you know, in some ways it's much more, you know, spiritually Nietzschean, even than some of Nietzsche's comments about it being innately good, right? Because of that distinction. Because if Dan were to say like, oh, look, this is essentially, we're now in the situation where the only thing that matters is the product that comes at the end of it, right?
It's an end unto itself, like, you know, like it's not like, this is like, we're going to use this, like this is the true case when it comes to art, and then this is relevant because we can turn it into use it to bolster a greater statement about life. It's like, this is true about art, and if you're an artist and if you're doing this, that's what matters to you. That is the important part.
Yeah. So, you know, in some ways, like, you know, keep this in mind, like, you could rehabilitate Nietzsche to make him more Nietzschean than in fact Nietzsche was, right? Yeah. And I think that that's also valuable, right? It's not, you know, you can't say, it wouldn't be fair to say that he's like a blank slate. He's clearly not. At the same time, there hasn't been enough, you know, kind of like just this kind of like thought about how can we rehabilitate this for our own purposes. Again, like people are just way too fucking scared of, you know, things that don't matter, and that's the thing. And Nietzsche himself, he would be very, you know, dismissive of this, like, you know, why are you just being such a coward about this? You know, in some ways, I can imagine him respecting a certain strain of left wing thought, right, that is very kind of ballsy and is very willing to do totally, you know, alien, perhaps even contradictory things, right, in a way that, you know, like very kind of myopic, you know, a silly conservatism is just like very, you know, it's just very scared to do. I was just recently listening to some right wingers talk about, you know, race and economics and shit, and everything just seems to me like I whenever I listen to this stuff, it doesn't matter left or right wing, everything is fueled by fear. And a kind of fear, that doesn't goad you to actually do things. It's a kind of fear that forces
it's like monkey brain kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like the Pinker thing again. Like, oh, if I like associate myself in any way with this person that's bad or whatever, then you know, like I'm going to lose clout, I'm going to lose status, and it really doesn't go any deeper than that. Yeah.
And in some ways, I mean, there need to be left wingers that positively appraise Nietzsche. Like, you got to get, you know, idiots like Jordan Peterson, you know, totally out of the conversation. This is not for them, right? If this is for the artists, guess what? This is absolutely not for Peterson in that regard. And I think like we can actually maybe move on, because I think the whole topic about like art and that's actually like book 2 kind of deals a lot with that. And there's actually a few aphorisms that I noted that like kind of directly like discuss this and that. So like I'd say probably we can return to
like that one if we keep moving through the book, because there's definitely a lot to be dealt with. Like book two is the kind of, it's kind of split between, it's the one about women, is the one about art, so definitely a
Mhm.
lot to be done there.